Welcome to the second part of our brain anatomy lesson. Remember, everything is bilaterally symmetrical in both your body and your brain. Everything on the left side is copied in mirror image on everything on the right side. What we see here is a much more detailed image of the spinal cord, which, as you can see, has little branches coming out of it, both on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, which innervate, which spread neurons throughout your body. So neurons are not limited to the central nervous system. Your whole body has neurons, and some parts of your body, like the tips of your fingers, have more neurons, and other parts of the body, like the back of your body, the back of your torso, has a less dense distribution of neurons. Everything goes through the spinal cord, either outgoing or ingoing, in the places that you see right there. And the spinal cord flows into the brainstem, and particularly the part that is called the lower brainstem. So this is identical to what you saw before from a slightly different point of view that is more anatomically realistic. When we move up from the brainstem, first of all, we see these large structures that look like little brains, which are called the cerebellum, and cerebellum means little brain. So this appeared to the anatomists centuries ago who had no microscopes and who only had the naked eye, but they founded the science of anatomy. So we look at the cerebellum from the left side, and the cerebellum is mainly for delicate motor control, like moving your fingers, for example, and probably also for moving your facial muscles and your speech muscles. Fine motor control is the formula for the cerebellum. Above the cerebellum, you can see the rear of the cortex, the occipital lobe, and to the left of that, you can see this structure that sticks out from the body of the brain a little bit like an arm. This would be the left arm in this imaginary similarity between the body and the brain. Above that, we have the parietal lobe, and in front of that, we have an enormous frontal cortex, especially human beings, compared to other related mammals. So there's something very special about the frontal lobes, in part because speech production is carried by the left hemisphere, the frontal lobe. But there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on. Although the two sides, the left and the right hemispheres, are symmetrical, they do have many different functions. The left hemisphere reliably involves speech production and forethought, things related to speech production and speech planning. So that is a major source of asymmetry between the two hemispheres. But in other ways, there are many, many similarities between the two hemispheres as well. And I don't believe that you can easily divide the two hemispheres into the left hemisphere for reasoning and the right hemisphere for emotions and intuitions. It's not that simple. And here again, we see an image of the left thalamus, and on top of the pons and the lower brainstem, very much like we saw it before, the thalamus, which you can only see the one on the left-hand side, resides like an egg in the middle of a sort of a bird's nest of the two cerebral hemispheres. People tend to think that the thalamus must be the center of the brain because that's the way it looks. But that's not true because the wiring of the thalamus goes in both directions. So it's a little bit like being in a city and you can see the downtown and you can pretend that the downtown is the center of the city. But really what's going on is a lot of traffic going back and forth, especially between the cortex and the thalamus. There are some very beautiful structures that surround the thalamus on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. They tend to be very beautiful circular structures, very elegant looking. This one is called the hippocampus. It's a really important structure, and it basically lives inside of the temporal lobe, if you remember where the temporal lobe was in the last picture. So this is how the fundamental gross anatomy, meaning the visible anatomy of the brain, looked to people 500 years ago who started to study the brain, and they didn't have microscopes. So they studied the brain with the naked eye and with a scalpel and a few tools. It was very simple. And it's good to do that because that allows you to relate all the major structures to each other spatially. Now, one of the confusing things about this core of the brain is that there are a number of structures that are kind of in parallel with each other. Right in front of the hippocampus, there is a structure called the amygdala that is especially famous for being involved in fear processing, which is obviously a survival thing for human beings and other animals. Surrounding those structures, there are the fluid ventricles, which are not really neural structures at all because there are very few neurons involved, but it's mostly a watery medium called cerebrospinal fluid. This is the fluid that flows throughout the spinal cord and into the brain, and it distributes cells and hormones and various molecules and stem cells and other materials as for the brain to metabolize based on glucose and oxygen coming in that the brain needs and carrying out waste materials that the body will get rid of. So the brain really has its internal circulatory system like the bloodstream, but separated from the bloodstream. Outside of the ventricles, we find a very beautiful structure, as you can see. On the left-hand side, we can see it very well. And this is called the basal ganglia. Ganglia basically means a clump of neurons, and basal means at the bottom of whatever the anatomical scientists were seeing at the time. So basal means the bottom clumps of neurons. The basal ganglia are very, very important, and they're primarily concerned with output structures, so that to control your body, to control your vocalization, and to do forward planning, you need the basal ganglia. These are very complex structures that all interact with each other, so they talk to each other. The basal ganglia, from this point of view, is a little bit different from our previous point of view. Remember, previously when we talked about the basal ganglia, we could imagine them as two shields on the sides of the thalami. The left-hand shield was a very beautiful structure. The right-hand shield is exactly the same thing in mirror image symmetry. So this is the same basal ganglia seen in a slightly different way. And the body of the basal ganglia, and you can see the two major divisions of the basal ganglia called the striatum and the putamen. The basal ganglia look a little bit different from this perspective than in our previous images. The basal ganglia are primarily involved with output control, control of action, and it consists of a number of nuclei, like most brain structures. The top nuclei are called the striatum, and the middle nuclei are called the putamen. But the important thing to remember is that the basal ganglia are involved in action control. And now we add the huge cerebral cortex on top of the two thalami. So there's a left and a right thalamus, and there's a left and a right hemisphere. These are colored white because they look white when you slice the brain the way you might slice a loaf of bread. But the white color is misleading because the neurons inside are actually gray, and they're a little bit other colors also, but we usually talk about them as gray matter. Gray matter shows up on the very outer layers of the cerebral cortex as you see it here. And that's very important because those are the places where the cell bodies of the neurons are located. The white matter consists of branches out of the cell bodies of the neurons that are surrounded by a cellular support system, cells called glia, which means glue, because they look like glue that kind of keeps everything together. So the white matter is what you get when you slice a loaf of bread, and the gray matter is what you look at from the outside because that's the very surface layer of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is functionally perhaps the single most important and distinctive brain structure, certainly among humans, where it is enormous, but also among other mammals. And here we see the entire brain seen from the outside, and obviously this huge cortex covers up a lot of the inner structures that we saw before. So you have to think about a kind of a core of the brain, starting from the brain stem and moving upward, as well as a matrix of the cerebral cortex that holds this core, or maybe it is sitting on the core, the vertical structures that go from the spinal cord, then the lower brainstem, then the upper brainstem, then the thalami, and all those interesting looking inner structures. And then on top of that, we have the cerebral cortex, which is enormous in size. And it's actually also enormous in importance in life. There is a lot of evidence showing that conscious perception, for example, depends upon the posterior cerebral cortex. And planning, speaking, forethought, probably imagination, depends upon the frontal half of the cortex. The posterior and the frontal are separated by a fold, by a valley called the central sulcus, which you can see here right in the middle between the front and the rear. And here you see a very nice cut through the cerebral cortex showing the white matter. And remember that the white matter is white because the neurons, which are grayish, are surrounded by white cells called glial cells, G-L-I-A-L, which looked to the early anatomists like a kind of a glue because they didn't have high-powered microscopes. When we look at it with very high-powered microscopes, of course, we realize that the white matter is really cells, they're support cells primarily, that feed and nurture and resupply the neurons and the synapses that connect the neurons to each other. So the white matter is very important, but it is misleading because what's really going on is 100 million neurons surrounded by white matter in order to keep the very active neurons metabolically supplied. On the outside of that ring, you can see something that might be the gray matter, because the gray matter is the exposed parts of the cerebral nerves, the neurons, and it mostly consists of these cell bodies and the other structures of those neurons that are very close to the cell bodies. The white matter mostly surrounds the very long axons of neurons that connect distant regions in the brain to each other. And here we see a rendering of the gray matter, which again is just the outer layer of 6 cells, which are mostly neuronal cell bodies that live on the outside, on the crust, in a sense, of the cortex. These are crucial neurons. They're very, very important. If you lose some of the neurons through accident or through other trauma, then of course the function of those neurons is going to change. But the cortex is an extremely adaptable organ of the body. And so the cortex will tend to try to fix problems. And early in life, it'll be able to do so. As you get older and older, the cortex gets more fixed in its functions. And here we see the overview of the brain and spinal cord again. And this will allow you to combine all the different parts that we talked about before into a single coherent image of the outer brain, the cerebellum, the lower brain stem, and above that the upper brain stem, and then flowing very beautifully into the spinal cord, which controls our bodies, both on the input side, the senses that we have in our fingertips, for example, and also on the output side, the control of the hands and fingers flows via the spinal cord and the brain stem through the arms to allow you to manipulate the world with your hands. Here we see the temporal lobe again, but now it's been cut out in such a way as to show the inside, looking like a sausage in a bun. The sausage is the hippocampus, and we do not quite see the amygdala, which lives in front of the sausage because it's covered up by temporal lobe. So this is a cutout image. It's a very useful one because it shows the relationship between the cortex and especially the temporal lobe, which sticks out on the left-hand side and also on the right-hand side, like an arm coming from the body. There's a lot of similarities, and of course, everything is bilaterally symmetrical in both your body and your brain.